The arrest that changed everything. The early morning light barely touched the edges of Oakwood City as Officer Jake Mitchell pulled his patrol car into the station parking lot. The world was still quiet, but his mind was anything but. His thoughts churned restlessly as he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. Today was just another day, another shift, another opportunity to enforce the law the way he believed it should be enforced. Jake had been an officer for over a decade, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. The badge was more than just a job to him. It was a legacy, a responsibility, a duty to keep the streets safe. That's what he told himself every morning when he buttoned up his uniform, adjusted his gun belt, and clipped on his badge. But lately, things had changed. The climate around policing had shifted, and every move he made was scrutinized under a microscope. Protests, lawsuits, politicians breathing down his neck. He felt like the whole world had turned against him. He didn't see himself as a bad cop. He followed the rules, did what he was trained to do. If people didn't like it, well, that wasn't his problem. As he stepped into the precinct, the hum of morning activity greeted him. Officers exchanged reports, coffee cups clinked, and phones rang. Sergeant Daniels, his commanding officer, stood near the briefing board, eyes flicking toward Jake. "Mitchell, you're on patrol in Oakwood Heights today," Daniels said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Keep it clean." Jake bristled at the words. Keep it clean. As if he didn't always follow the book. "Yes, sir," he muttered, grabbing the keys to his cruiser. Oakwood Heights was the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. Mansions, luxury cars, pristine lawns trimmed with near-military precision. It was the kind of place where trouble rarely happened, but if it did, the residents expected an immediate response. As Jake drove through the tree-lined streets, his mind drifted to his upcoming trial. It was ridiculous. A few complaints from people who didn't like the way he did his job, and suddenly he was being dragged into court, his entire career put under a microscope. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "They don't understand," he muttered under his breath. "I'm just doing my job." His radio crackled to life, but instead of an emergency, it was Officer Reynolds, one of the younger cops on the force. "Yo, Mitchell," Reynolds' voice came through, laced with amusement. "You ready for that circus of a trial next week?" Jake sighed. "Yeah, can't wait." "Better hope the judge goes easy on you," Reynolds joked. "I heard he's real tough on bad cops." Jake scoffed. "I'm not a bad cop. Didn't say you were, but, might want to watch yourself. This judge, he's got a reputation." Jake grunted and turned onto Maple Avenue, ignoring Reynolds' words. His eyes scanned the street, searching for anything out of place. That's when he saw him. A black man in his late 40s stood outside one of the grandest houses on the street. He was dressed casually, but something about him set off alarms in Jake's mind. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. What's he doing here? It wasn't an outright crime, but it was suspicious. He flipped on his patrol lights and pulled over to the curb, adrenaline kicking in. Without pausing to consider the situation, without questioning his own instincts, he stepped out of the car and approached. "Hey." Jake's voice was sharp as he strode toward the man. "What are you doing here?" The man turned, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Excuse me." Jake squared his shoulders, his posture authoritative. "I need to see some ID." The man hesitated for only a moment before calmly reaching into his pocket. "I'm just waiting for my driver," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I live here." Jake's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe him. "Live here, huh?" He snatched the ID, scrutinizing the name. David Turner. The name meant nothing to him. He glanced at the house, then back at the man. "You expect me to believe that?" Jake scoffed. David sighed, clearly exasperated. "Officer, I don't know what you're assuming, but I have every right to be here." Jake ignored the response, his mind already made up. "You're loitering," he said flatly, "and I don't like people making trouble in this neighborhood. A jogger slowed her pace, watching. A couple walking their dog paused. Phones were coming out, cameras recording. "Officer, please," David said, his patience waning. "This is unnecessary." Jake's frustration boiled over. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "What?" David's expression turned to disbelief. "Are you serious?" "I said turn around," Jake growled. The tension in the air was suffocating. People were watching, recording. But Jake didn't care. He was convinced he was doing the right thing. David exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, but he complied. The metal of the handcuffs clinked as Jake secured them around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Jake recited mechanically, his voice laced with disdain. The drive to the station was tense. David sat in the back, silent, his face unreadable. Jake glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You people always think you can outsmart the law," he muttered under his breath. David met his gaze in the mirror, his expression calm but firm. "Officer, I hope you realize soon that you've made a very serious mistake." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, and why's that?" David didn't answer. Back at the station, Jake led David inside. Past desks and curious glances, he dumped a form on the table in front of him. "Fill this out," he ordered. David picked up the pen, his movements precise. As he wrote, Jake's eyes flickered over the form. And then he saw it. Occupation: Superior Court Judge. Jake's heart stopped. His throat went dry. His grip on the desk tightened as realization crashed into him. David Turner. Judge David Turner. The judge presiding over his trial. Jake's breath hitched. Oh, shit. A reckoning begins. The weight of a name. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. His hands, once so confident in slapping those cuffs on David Turner, now trembled as his eyes scanned the paperwork again. Superior Court Judge. His mind reeled. Judge Turner. The judge presiding over his case. Jake's breath turned shallow. His confidence, his ironclad belief that he was always doing the right thing, felt like it had just been yanked out from under him. He had walked into this morning believing he was a soldier of order, the last line between civilization and chaos. Now he felt like the villain of his own story. David Turner, however, sat calmly in the interrogation room, his wrists still cuffed. He didn't demand the cuffs be taken off. He didn't shout or curse. He simply folded his hands on the table and waited. It was almost worse than if he had lashed out. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Jake cleared his throat, trying to summon his usual authority. "Judge Turner," he began, his voice dry. I wasn't aware." David lifted a single eyebrow. "You weren't aware that I lived in my own house." His voice was measured, his posture relaxed, yet there was a quiet storm beneath it. Jake swallowed hard. He knew that any misstep here could be the final nail in the coffin of his career. "Look, sir, this was just, a standard procedure. I thought you were a criminal." David finished for him, his tone sharp now. "Because I was standing in front of my own home, minding my own business." Jake flinched. The words stung in a way he hadn't expected. He had thought of himself as right for so long. But now, with the weight of this mistake pressing down on him, he felt like he had walked into quicksand. "Officer Mitchell," David said, his tone patient, yet firm. "Take off these cuffs." Jake hesitated, his fingers twitching near his belt. He was still grasping for control, for some way to dig himself out of this. I need to process the arrest." David's gaze hardened. "Officer Mitchell, I suggest you take these cuffs off before you make this situation even worse for yourself." Jake had never been on the other side of power before, never felt this kind of pressure. He was always the one holding the authority, dictating the terms. But not today. With a reluctant sigh, Jake pulled out the key and unlocked the cuffs, wincing as they slid off David's wrists. The judge rubbed them slowly, never breaking eye contact with Jake. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stared. And somehow, that was worse. David stood, straightened his cuffs, and spoke with the controlled patience of a man who had endured far worse than this moment. "You'll be hearing from me soon, Officer Mitchell." And with that, he walked out of the station, leaving Jake standing there, rattled, ashamed, and, for the first time in his career, afraid. The aftermath. Jake sat frozen at his desk, his hands gripping his temples. His world felt like it was caving in. His fellow officers were whispering. Some of them had seen what happened. Word would spread. He had arrested a judge, not just any judge, the one presiding over his case, and he had racially profiled him. He could already imagine how it would play out in the media. Disgraced officer arrests innocent black judge in his own neighborhood. His stomach twisted. This could end his career. His trial next week was already an uphill battle. And now he had gifted the prosecution the perfect example of his behavior. He barely heard Sergeant Daniels approaching until a heavy hand clapped onto his shoulder. "Mitchell," Daniels said, his voice low. "What the hell did you just do?" Jake opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words felt empty even to him. He exhaled sharply. "I thought he was suspicious." Daniel's nostrils flared. Suspicious. A black man standing outside his own house in a wealthy neighborhood is suspicious to you. Jake's face burned. He wanted to protest. He wanted to push back and say that this was his job, that he was just keeping order, following protocol. But the excuses had begun to taste like acid in his mouth. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea what you just did? We've been trying to clean up the department's image after all the complaints, and now this." He slammed a file onto Jake's desk. "Internal Affairs is gonna be all over this, and I can't save you from it." Jake clenched his jaw. "Sir, Save it," Daniels cut him off. His eyes were filled with disappointment. Genuine disappointment. "Mitchell, you need to wake the hell up before it's too late." Jake felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just shame. It was doubt. And that scared him more than anything. A night of reflection. Jake went home that night in silence. His wife, Sarah, was already in the kitchen when he walked in, stirring a pot on the stove. She glanced at him with mild curiosity. "You're home early," she noted. Jake said nothing, just collapsed into a chair at the table. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face. Sarah frowned, setting down the spoon. "Jake?" Her voice softened. "What happened?" He exhaled shakily, his hands clasping together tightly. What was he supposed to say? That he had arrested a judge? That he had judged a man by the color of his skin? That he was starting to think maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong this whole time? He swallowed thickly. "I made a mistake." Sarah's brows furrowed. What kind of mistake? Jake hesitated. He wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and whispered, "The kind that could ruin me." Sarah sat across from him, her expression unreadable. And then, after a long pause, she said, "Maybe it's time to start thinking about why." That single sentence cracked something deep inside Jake. Because the truth was, he did know why. He just hadn't wanted to face it. The call that changed everything. The next morning, Jake woke to a call from his lawyer. He answered groggily, his mind still clouded by the restless night before. "Mitchell," his lawyer's voice came through. "We've got a situation." Jake's stomach dropped. What kind of situation? A sigh on the other end. "Judge Turner made a statement to the court this morning. He's not just presiding over your case anymore." Jake's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the lawyer said grimly, "he's become a witness." The floor felt like it had been ripped out from under Jake. Everything, his trial, his career, his entire life, had just taken a turn for the worst. And for the first time in years, Jake realized something terrifying. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was the antagonist. And now he had to decide if he was going to keep running from that truth or face it. The trial of truth. The courtroom awakening. Jake Mitchell had always walked into a courtroom with his chin high and his shoulders squared, wearing the badge like a suit of armor. He had testified against criminals, spoken with certainty, and believed with unwavering confidence that he was on the right side of the law. Not today. Today, he wasn't walking in as an enforcer of the law. Today, he was the one on trial. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse loomed before him, more imposing than ever. He hesitated at the steps, his breath coming in shallow puffs. He was dressed in a suit, not his uniform, and without that badge clipped to his chest, he felt smaller. His lawyer, Matthew Garner, clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me, Jake," he said, lowering his voice. "This is serious. Turner isn't just another judge. He's respected. If he paints you as a racist, you're done." Jake swallowed. I'm not racist." Garner sighed. "It doesn't matter what you think you are. It matters what you did. You arrested an innocent man because of your bias, and that man just happens to be the judge presiding over your trial." The words stung, not because they were unfair, but because deep down, Jake knew they were true. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the courtroom doors open and stepped inside. The moment he entered, he felt the weight of every stare. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras clicking. His fellow officers sat in the gallery, their faces unreadable. But it was the community, the everyday people, the black men and women, the families, that made Jake's stomach twist into knots. He saw the anger, the disappointment, the exhaustion. They weren't just here for him. They were here because they'd seen too many men like him walk into a courtroom and get away with what he had done. And in the center of it all, sitting high on the judge's bench, was David Turner. Judge Turner's expression was unreadable. No anger, no gloating, just calm professionalism. It was unnerving. "All rise." The bailiff's voice rang out. Everyone stood. The gavel struck, and the trial began. A past laid bare. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed black woman named Vanessa Carter, wasted no time in tearing into Jake's record. "Officer Mitchell has a history of racial profiling," she began, pacing before the jury. "Multiple complaints filed against him by citizens of color. Repeated arrests made without proper cause. And then, just days before his own trial." She turned, gesturing toward David Turner, who sat watching from the bench. "He arrests a sitting judge in front of his own home." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Jake's hands clenched under the table. Carter turned to Jake. "Officer Mitchell, do you deny that you have disproportionately stopped and arrested black men in this city?" Jake opened his mouth. The answer should have been no. He should have denied it, defended himself. But then, he caught David Turner's gaze. And suddenly, the words died in his throat, because he knew Turner already knew the answer. Jake hesitated. "I was just doing my job." Carter raised an eyebrow. "And tell me, Officer Mitchell, what part of your job made you assume that Judge Turner, a man standing in front of his own home, was a criminal?" Silence. Jake's throat felt dry. The room waited. He swallowed. "I made a mistake." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Carter nodded slowly. "Yes, you did. And that mistake, Officer Mitchell, is part of a pattern, one that has harmed the very community you swore to protect." She turned, flipping open a file. "Let's talk about Marcus Holloway." Jake stiffened. Carter pulled up a police report on the large screen beside the jury. The mugshot of a 16-year-old black boy stared back at him. "This boy," Carter said, her voice sharp, "was arrested by Officer Mitchell last year. The charge: resisting arrest." She turned to the jury. What was young Marcus doing before Officer Mitchell approached him? She let the question hang in the air before answering it herself. He was waiting for the bus. The courtroom tensed. Jake gritted his teeth, remembering that day. He had seen Marcus standing near a store and assumed he was loitering. He had questioned him, demanded ID, asked why he was there. The kid had talked back, frustrated, and that was all it took for Jake to escalate the situation. He had thrown him against a wall. He had handcuffed him, and then charged him when the kid reacted like any scared 16-year-old would. Carter looked at Jake, her eyes filled with quiet fire. "How many more, Officer Mitchell?" she asked. "How many more innocent men and boys have suffered because of your mistakes?" Jake felt a cold sweat on his back. He had no answer. The judge's verdict. The courtroom held its breath as David Turner finally spoke. "Officer Mitchell," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you now understand the harm you have caused?" Jake's chest felt tight. He gripped the table in front of him. He had spent years dismissing this conversation. He had heard the complaints, read the reports, listened to activists talk about injustice. He had ignored it all. But now that he was on the other side of it, he couldn't deny it anymore. Jake exhaled shakily. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I do." Another murmur rippled through the crowd. Judge Turner nodded, then spoke to the room. "I've seen many officers sit in that seat. Some who've made poor decisions, some who have deliberately abused their power. Officer Mitchell, I don't believe you are beyond redemption. But you need to face what you've done." Jake braced himself. This was it. The ruling that would decide his entire future. Judge Turner's voice carried through the silent courtroom. "You will not be sentenced to prison." Jake's breath hitched. Instead, Turner continued, "You will spend 1 full year working in the very community you have harmed." Jake's eyes widened. "You will mentor underprivileged youth at the Oakwood Community Center. You will work with the same boys and young men you have labeled as suspicious for so long. You will hear their stories. You will see the world from their eyes." The words rang in Jake's ears. The courtroom exploded into chatter. Carter nodded in approval. His lawyer sighed in relief. The reporter scrambled to capture the moment. But Jake felt like he had just stepped into an entirely different world. The beginning of something new. Hours later, as Jake walked out of the courthouse, he felt the eyes of the people still on him, watching, waiting. And then he spotted David Turner standing near the steps. Judge Turner met his gaze. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smirking. He just looked at Jake like he was a man at a crossroads. Jake approached cautiously. He hesitated. "Thank you." Turner studied him for a moment before replying. "Don't thank me yet, Officer Mitchell," he said, voice steady. "Thank me after you change." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, no longer a policeman standing above the law. Just a man who had a long way to go and a debt to repay, a man unarmed, a new beginning or a punishment. Jake Mitchell had walked through the doors of the Oakwood Community Center more times than he could count. But never like this. Never as a man stripped of his authority. Never as a man without his badge, without his gun, without the things that had defined him for so long. No, today he walked in as a convict serving court-ordered community service. It still didn't feel real. The building was old, with peeling paint and floors that creaked under the weight of each hesitant step he took. Children's voices echoed from the rec room down the hall, their laughter foreign to him. He had spent years patrolling the streets, stopping kids who reminded him of the ones inside this very building. And now he was expected to teach them. "Officer Mitchell," came a voice from ahead. Jake looked up. A woman, Margaret Thompson, stood with her arms crossed, eyeing him like he was the enemy. She was in her late 50s, tall, sharp-eyed, with the posture of someone who had seen it all and had no time for excuses. Jake forced himself to stand a little straighter. "Yes, Mom." Margaret scoffed. "Don't ma'am me," and dropped the officer bit. "You're just Jake now." Jake bit the inside of his cheek. He didn't like how that sounded. He had been Officer Mitchell for so long. Just Jake felt exposed. Margaret studied him, her gaze assessing. Then, after an uncomfortable silence, she motioned for him to follow her down the hallway. They passed colorful murals, handprints of kids who had passed through these halls, photos of smiling faces, so different from the mugshots he was used to seeing. Margaret finally stopped in front of a door and turned to face him. "You're here to work with the kids, not as a cop, but as a mentor. You're here to listen, to help." She folded her arms. "Can you handle that, Jake?" He wanted to snap that he wasn't some idiot. That, of course, he could handle talking to kids. But instead, he swallowed down his pride. "Yes." Margaret narrowed her eyes. She didn't believe him. And honestly, he wasn't sure he believed himself either. The first test. Marcus. The room Jake was assigned to was small but lively. Plastic tables, a whiteboard covered in math problems, stacks of old textbooks that had seen better days. And then there was the boy sitting alone in the back corner. Marcus. Jake had read his file before coming. 17. In and out of juvenile detention. Failing half his classes. Short temper. The kind of kid Jake had arrested dozens of times before. The kind of kid he never looked twice at. Now Marcus was his responsibility. Jake exhaled and walked over. "Marcus, right?" Marcus barely spared him a glance. "What's it to you?" Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being ignored. His first instinct was to assert control, demand respect. But he couldn't do that here. He wasn't a cop here. "I'm supposed to help with tutoring," Jake said, keeping his voice neutral. "You need help with anything." Marcus finally looked up, really looked at him. And then he laughed. Laughed right in his face. "Man, you gotta be kidding me," Marcus said, shaking his head. "Ain't no cop gonna teach me nothing." Jake stiffened. "I'm not a cop anymore." Marcus smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, tell that to your face." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, a familiar heat, one he had relied on for years. But he forced himself to push it down. Because for the first time he realized, this kid had every right to hate him. Jake had never given him a reason not to. So instead of snapping, instead of pushing back, Jake sat down across from Marcus. And he said the words he had never said before. "You're right." Marcus blinked. Jake took a breath. "You're right to not trust me. I wouldn't trust me either." The smirk faded from Marcus's face. He sat forward, staring at Jake like he had just grown a second head. Jake let the silence sit between them before finally speaking again. "But I'm still here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "So maybe we could start over." Marcus didn't respond immediately, but he didn't walk away either. And maybe that was a start. Clashing with the past. The longer Jake stayed at the center, the more he began to see. He saw the exhaustion on Margaret's face, the way she carried the weight of every kid who walked through those doors. He saw the way the kids looked at him, some with curiosity, most with suspicion. He was still the enemy to them. And he saw himself, not the man he thought he was, but the man he had actually been. A man who had judged before listening. A man who had taken instead of giving. A man who had never considered what came after he slapped the cuffs on someone. Now he had no choice but to face what he had done. One evening, after closing, Jake stayed behind, helping clean up. Margaret sat at a nearby table, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You surprised me today," she finally said. Jake glanced at her. "How so?" She shrugged. "You didn't storm out when Marcus laughed at you." Jake let out a bitter chuckle. "Wasn't the first time someone's laughed at me." Margaret studied him. "You ever wonder why these kids don't trust cops, Jake?" Jake hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "I'm starting to." Margaret leaned forward, her voice softer than before. "Then keep going. You're on the right path." Jake exhaled, staring down at his hands. For the first time, he hoped she was right. The test of change. As the months passed, Jake found himself changing, not just in how he saw these kids, but in how he saw himself. He learned that Marcus wasn't just an angry kid. He had a mother working 3 jobs and a father locked up for something minor that had snowballed into a sentence he couldn't escape. He learned that Tyrone, the shy 12-year-old who avoided eye contact, had once watched his older brother get slammed against a police car by officers who never even bothered to ask questions. He learned that these kids weren't the criminals he had always assumed. They were just kids. And they had stories. Stories that, for the first time, Jake was actually listening to. But then, one night, his past caught up with him. The breaking point. It happened outside the center. Jake had stayed late, helping Marcus with an assignment, when suddenly he heard raised voices. He stepped outside and saw a group of teenagers arguing. 2 of them squared up, fists clenched. Marcus was in the middle of it. Jake's instincts kicked in. He had broken up fights before. This was nothing new. But when he stepped forward, Marcus's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Back off, cop," he snarled. The words hit Jake like a slap. "I'm not," Jake started, but then he stopped. Because he saw it. The fear. The deep, embedded fear in Marcus's eyes. It wasn't him Marcus was seeing. It was every officer who had ever shoved him against a wall. Every cop who had thrown him in the back of a car. Every authority figure who had told him he was nothing more than a criminal. Jake's stomach twisted. Because that was exactly who he had been. For so many years. Jake stepped back, raising his hands. "I'm not here to arrest anyone," he said slowly. "I'm just here to make sure no one does something they'll regret." Marcus's breathing was heavy. His fists were still clenched. But after a long pause, he nodded. The fight dissolved. And for the first time, Marcus looked at Jake not with anger, but with something close to understanding. And Jake realized, in that moment, maybe he wasn't just serving a sentence. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he was actually doing something good. Breaking barriers. Bridging the gap. Marcus's fists slowly unclenched, his breath heavy in the cold night air. The tension that had threatened to explode between the boys outside the community center began to settle. Jake stood still, hands at his sides, not reaching for a weapon, not barking orders. Just watching, listening, waiting. It was foreign to him, this approach. De-escalation, understanding, compassion. He had spent so many years on the force reacting instead of reasoning. But now, without his badge as a shield, without his gun as an answer to every problem, he had to rely on something he had never truly leaned on before, his words. He cleared his throat and looked at Marcus. "You okay?" Marcus exhaled sharply, then ran a hand over his face. "Man, I don't know." Jake nodded, stepping a little closer. "You want to talk about it?" Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. "What? Like a therapy session?" "Nah, I'm good." But he didn't leave. That was progress. Jake leaned against the brick wall of the center, keeping his stance relaxed. "I used to think talking about stuff was useless too," he admitted. "Figured if I didn't deal with it, then it wasn't real." Marcus looked at him sideways. "Yeah. How'd that work out for you?" Jake let out a humorless laugh. "Not great. Landed me right here." Marcus smirked at that but didn't push back. He stared at the pavement, kicking at a loose pebble with his shoe. "They think I'm weak," Marcus muttered, almost to himself. "If I walk away from a fight, everyone thinks I'm soft." Jake studied him carefully. "And what do you think?" Marcus hesitated. His hands balled into fists again, and for a moment, Jake thought he might shut down completely. But then something shifted in his expression. "I don't know," Marcus finally admitted. I don't want to be like my brother." Jake's brow furrowed. "Your brother?" Marcus's jaw tensed. "Yeah. He got locked up last year. Said he was just standing up for himself. But now he's stuck. Gone. And I keep thinking, if I keep doing what he did, I'll end up in the same place. Jake swallowed hard. The words hit him in a way he wasn't expecting. Because how many times had he been the cop who made that happen? How many times had he put a kid like Marcus in cuffs, chalking it up as just another arrest without considering what happened to them after? He had never thought about it before, but he was thinking about it now. You don't have to follow that same path, Jake said, his voice quieter now. You're smart, Marcus. You've got options. Marcus scoffed. Yeah? What options? Ain't nobody out here handing me scholarships, man. Jake inhaled. Maybe not, but I can help you figure something out. Marcus frowned, suspicious. Why do you care? You ain't my teacher. You ain't my social worker. Hell, up until a few months ago, you were just another cop who wouldn't have looked at me twice. Jake couldn't deny it. Marcus wasn't wrong. Jake had spent his entire career looking at kids like Marcus and assuming the worst. He had never stopped to ask questions, never stopped to see them as more than potential suspects. That realization hit him like a gut punch. I care, Jake said, choosing his words carefully, because I should have cared a long time ago. Marcus studied him for a long moment, his gaze skeptical but not entirely dismissive. Jake knew this was only the beginning. Trust wasn't something you built overnight. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Facing his past. The next morning, Jake walked into the community center with something weighing on his chest. His conversation with Marcus had shaken him. Not because Marcus had been aggressive. Not because he had been disrespectful. But because Jake had seen himself in him. He had seen a young man who was angry at the world, who felt like life had already decided his fate for him. And wasn't that exactly how Jake had felt lately? Like everything had been decided. His career, his reputation, his worth. He needed to talk to someone. And he knew exactly who. Jake found Margaret Thompson in her office, scribbling notes on a stack of files. The woman was tireless, running this place with nothing but sheer will and determination. She barely looked up as he stepped inside. You're early. Jake sat down across from her. Margaret, I need to ask you something. She finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. What's on your mind? He hesitated, then exhaled. How do you do it? Margaret set her pen down. Do what? Jake gestured around the office. All of this. Every day. You work with these kids. You fight to keep this place running. You keep going even when it feels like nothing changes. How? Margaret studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. Because I don't have a choice, she said simply. Jake frowned. What do you mean? She sighed, folding her hands together. These kids don't get to just walk away from their lives, Jake. They don't get to take a break from being judged, from struggling, from trying to survive in a system that wasn't built for them. If I quit, if I decide it's too much and walk away, then who's left fighting for them? Jake sat in silence, digesting her words. Margaret leaned forward, eyes sharp. You're looking for some grand answer, some reason that makes it easier. But the truth is, it's not easy. It's never easy. You just have to decide if you're willing to show up anyway. Jake swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life believing justice came from authority. But Margaret, she wasn't a cop. She didn't have a badge. Yet she was doing more for these kids than he ever had. He felt something shift inside him. Maybe for the first time, he was beginning to understand. The lesson he never expected. The weeks passed, and slowly, Jake found his place. He wasn't just the ex-cop anymore. He was just Jake. The kids still eyed him warily, but some had begun to soften. Tyrone, the quiet 12-year-old who never spoke to him, finally started answering questions during tutoring sessions. Maria, the aspiring doctor, asked Jake about his time as an officer, not to judge, but out of curiosity. And Marcus still kept his walls up, but he was there. He kept showing up. One afternoon, Jake found Marcus at one of the back tables, staring at a blank sheet of paper. "Homework?" Jake asked. Marcus shook his head. "Some college thing. I gotta write an essay." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And?" Marcus shrugged. "What the hell am I supposed to write about? Ain't like anyone wants to hear my story." Jake pulled out a chair and sat down. "Maybe they do," he said. Marcus scoffed. "What, you want to read about all the times I almost got locked up?" Jake met his gaze. "I want to read about who you are." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Jake leaned forward. "You think people don't care about your story? Then tell it anyway. Make them listen." Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, he picked up his pen. As he started writing, Jake felt something deep in his chest. Pride. Because this, right here, felt more meaningful than anything he had done in his entire career. And for the first time, Jake Mitchell finally felt like he was making a difference. The road ahead. Jake knew he still had a long way to go. He couldn't erase the years of damage he had done overnight, but he could keep showing up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start making things right. The measure of a man. A year of change. The months at Oakwood Community Center stretched on, each day chipping away at the version of Jake Mitchell he had once been. At first, the center had been a punishment, a sentence handed down by a judge who had every right to see him as just another bad cop. But now it felt like the only thing that made sense. He was no longer Officer Mitchell. He was just Jake. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. The kids still eyed him with caution, but their walls were slowly coming down. Marcus still tested him, but not in the same way. Now it was through sarcasm and wit instead of outright hostility. And Jake had earned that much. But trust wasn't a switch. It wasn't something you could turn on just because you decided to be better. Trust had to be built. And Jake was still laying the foundation. The unexpected visit. Jake was cleaning up the tutoring room late one evening when he heard footsteps behind him. "Didn't peg you for a janitor." Jake froze. That voice. Judge David Turner. Jake turned slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. The last time he had seen Turner, it had been in the courtroom, when he had been sentenced, stripped of his rank, and forced to confront the reality of what he had done. Now the judge stood in the dim light of the center's main hallway, dressed in a crisp suit, watching Jake with a look that was hard to read. "Judge Turner," Jake said, a little stiffly. David smiled, just a little. "Relaxed, Jake. I'm not here to check your progress like some parole officer." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Then, why are you here?" David took a slow step forward, glancing around the empty center. "I wanted to see for myself." Jake frowned. "See what?" David folded his hands behind his back. "If you've changed." Jake stiffened. "And what do you think?" David didn't answer right away. He studied Jake for a long, quiet moment before finally speaking. "You tell me," he said. "Have you changed?" The question hit Jake harder than he expected, because he wasn't sure how to answer it. He had been working at the center for months now. He had been listening to these kids, learning their struggles, understanding the damage he had caused. But was that enough? Could a year of service really make up for years of prejudice? Could a man like him ever truly erase the harm he had done? Jake swallowed hard. I don't know." David nodded. "Good. That means you're finally asking the right questions." Jake frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" David took another slow step forward. "Change isn't about a single moment of realization. It's not about showing up at the center and expecting to be forgiven like it's some kind of redemption arc. Change is work. It's daily choices. It's who you choose to be when no one's looking." Jake's jaw tightened. "I never did any of this for a redemption story." "Then why are you still here?" David countered. "Your sentence is almost over, Jake. You could just go through the motions, finish your time, and walk away." Jake opened his mouth. and then shut it, because he didn't want to walk away. For the first time, this work, these kids, this community, this place felt real. And that realization scared the hell out of him. David must have seen something shift in his expression because he sighed and nodded. "I'll be watching, Jake," he said. Not as a judge, just as a man who's seen what happens when people pretend to change instead of actually doing it. Then, without another word, David Turner walked out of the center. And Jake was left standing there, feeling more lost than ever. A different kind of fight. The next day, the community center was packed. A local sponsor had donated basketball equipment, and Margaret had arranged a youth tournament to celebrate. It was the first time Jake had seen so many people in one place. Parents, kids, volunteers, even a few local business owners. But he couldn't focus on the event. His mind was still stuck on Turner's words. "Have you changed?" The question rattled in his skull like a bullet. Jake was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice when the fight broke out. The sound of shouting snapped him back to reality. Jake turned just in time to see two boys shoving each other near the entrance. One of them was Marcus. The other was a kid Jake didn't recognize. Before he could think, Jake was moving. Old instincts kicked in. His body knew exactly what to do. Break it up. Control the situation. Maintain order. But something stopped him. Something that had never stopped him before. He saw the way Marcus flinched when he moved closer. He saw the way the other kid's eyes darted toward the exit, like he was expecting to be thrown to the ground, expecting cuffs to be slapped on his wrists. Jake froze. For the first time, he wasn't looking at just another fight. He was looking at two scared kids, and he knew exactly how this moment would have played out a year ago. A cop would have stepped in. Voices would have been raised. Threats would have been made. One of them, or both, would have ended up in the back of a patrol car. But this wasn't the street. This wasn't his patrol. This was their space. Jake took a breath. Then, instead of grabbing Marcus, instead of barking orders, he said, "Talk to me." The boys hesitated. Jake took another slow step forward, keeping his hands loose at his sides. "What's going on?" he asked again, softer this time. Marcus's chest was still rising and falling heavily. His fists clenched. His jaw was tight. Jake could see it. The rage, the frustration, the urge to fight because it was all he had ever known. But instead of pushing, instead of demanding, Jake just waited. Finally, Marcus exhaled. He was talking shit, Marcus muttered, glaring at the other boy. Said I was just some dropout who was gonna end up in jail. Jake's stomach twisted. Because Marcus had heard those words before. Hell, Jake had probably said them once. He turned to the other boy. That true? The kid, probably no older than 15, shrugged, looking away. I don't know, man. People say stuff. Jake nodded, considering his next words carefully. Then he looked at Marcus. What do you think? Jake asked. Do you believe him? Marcus stiffened. Hell no. Then why let his words decide your future? Jake asked simply. Marcus blinked. The other boy blinked. Even Jake was surprised at what had just come out of his mouth. But it worked. The tension cracked. And instead of another punch, Marcus just let out a heavy breath, shaking his head. Whatever, man. I don't got time for this. He turned, walking away. And just like that, the fight was over. Jake exhaled. Not because he had broken up a fight, but because he had stopped himself. And that meant everything. Becoming more than a badge. Later that night, Margaret found Jake cleaning up the gym. You handled that well, she said. Jake didn't look up. I almost didn't. Margaret tilted her head. But you did. Jake hesitated. Then, after a long pause, he said, I think I finally get it. Margaret folded her arms. Get what? Jake met her gaze. I spent years thinking my badge made me a good man, he admitted. But it didn't. He swallowed hard. These kids, They don't need another cop telling them what to do. They need someone to see them. Margaret's expression softened. Jake wiped a hand over his face. I want to stay. After my sentence is over. Margaret smiled. And for the first time, Jake felt free. Not because of a badge. Not because of authority. But because he had finally found his place. And it had nothing to do with being a cop. Redemption is a journey, not a destination. The decision to stay. Jake Mitchell never thought he'd be standing in Judge David Turner's chambers by choice. Yet, here he was. The office was tidy, but not in an overly meticulous way. Books lined the shelves, some well-worn, some brand new, their spines showing subjects that ranged from criminal law to social justice. The air smelled faintly of coffee and aged paper, and for the first time in months, Jake wasn't sure where to stand. Judge Turner sat behind his desk, glasses perched on his nose as he scanned a document in front of him. After a moment, he looked up, studying Jake with that same measured, unreadable expression. Jake shifted uncomfortably. I appreciate you meeting with me, Your Honor. David set his pen down. You're not on trial anymore. Jake, you can just call me David. Jake hesitated, then nodded. David. A pause. Then, after exhaling sharply, Jake took the leap he never thought he'd take. I want to stay at the center, he admitted, even after my community service is over. David blinked, but his expression remained neutral. Why? Jake swallowed. He had thought about this moment. What he would say, how he would convince David that he wasn't just looking for redemption, that this wasn't just some forced act of goodwill. But now that he was here, face to face with the man he had once wrongfully arrested, words felt small. Because it's where I need to be, Jake finally said. Because I spent too many years tearing down the people I was supposed to protect. And because, for the first time, I feel like I'm actually making a difference. David leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He studied Jake for a long moment, then finally spoke. You understand that this doesn't erase what you did, right? David said, his voice calm but firm. You don't get to wake up one day and suddenly be fixed. Change doesn't work like that. Jake exhaled, nodding. I know. David held his gaze. And you're ready for that. Ready to spend every day proving, not just to me, but to them, that you're not the same man you were. Jake thought of Marcus, of Tyrone, of all the kids he had once dismissed without a second thought. He thought of how close he had come to losing himself to the job. He thought of all the people he had wronged. And then, finally, he nodded. Yes, he said. I'm ready. David studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. All right, he said. Let's see what you can do. Breaking the cycle. The decision to stay at Oakwood Community Center didn't mean the work was over. If anything, it meant the real work was just beginning. Jake had spent his career enforcing rules, but he had never taken the time to understand the people those rules were meant to protect. Now he was doing just that. And it was harder than he had ever imagined. One of the biggest challenges came from the kids who still didn't trust him. And honestly, Jake didn't blame them. They had every reason to doubt his intentions, to wonder if this was all some long con, some act to clear his conscience. Marcus, especially, didn't let him off the hook so easily. You serious about staying? Marcus asked one afternoon, crossing his arms as he eyed Jake from across the community center gym. Jake nodded. Yeah. Marcus scoffed. Man, you were a cop a few months ago. Now you're just cool with working with us. Just like that. Jake sighed, choosing his words carefully. Not just like that. It's been a process. Marcus studied him, skeptical. Why though? What do you even get out of this? Jake considered that for a moment. Then, he answered honestly, I get to finally do something right. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. But Jake noticed the tension in his shoulders ease. Just a little. A second chance for more than just him. One of the things Jake had never considered as a cop was what happened after an arrest. It was easy to slap cuffs on someone, throw them in the back of a car, and call it a day. It was harder to see what happened after they were released. He learned this firsthand when Marcus's older brother, Darnell, was let out of prison early on parole. Darnell had served 18 months for a minor charge that had spiraled out of control. Jake remembered seeing his name before. He had even processed one of his arrests. Now he was back, and he had no idea where to go from here. Margaret approached Jake one afternoon, a file in her hand. "Darnell Holloway just got out," she said, "and he needs work." Jake frowned. "What kind of work?" Margaret folded her arms. "I was thinking, maybe he could help around the center. Give him a steady income. Keep him off the streets." Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure how Marcus would feel about that, let alone Darnell himself. But he also knew that if he had learned anything over the past year, it was that second chances mattered. So that night, he met with Marcus and Darnell at the center. Marcus was immediately on edge. "What's he doing here?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "I work here now," Jake said simply, "and I want to offer Darnell a job." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "You want to hire my brother? The same guy your people arrested?" Jake exhaled. "Yeah." Darnell, who had been mostly quiet up until now, finally spoke. His voice was rough, hardened. "Why?" Jake met his gaze. "Because I think you deserve a shot." Darnell chuckled bitterly. "Funny. Didn't think cops thought people like me deserved anything." Jake didn't flinch. He had earned that judgment. But still, he didn't back down. "I'm not a cop anymore," he said. "I'm just a guy trying to do better." Darnell studied him for a long time. And then, finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll try." Marcus, however, still looked skeptical. "This isn't gonna fix everything." "Man." Jake nodded. "I know." Marcus sighed. Then, reluctantly, he shrugged. "Guess we'll see how this goes." Jake knew that was as close to approval as he was gonna get. And honestly, it was enough. The night that changed everything. Again. Things had started to feel right at the center. Jake had found purpose in his work. The kids, while still hesitant, had started to accept him. He had a routine, a role, a place where he could actually make a difference. But then, one night, everything almost came crashing down. Marcus was late to the center. He never missed a tutoring session. Jake knew something was wrong. It wasn't until after dark that Marcus finally showed up, bruised, bloody, and shaken. Jake's stomach dropped. "What happened?" he demanded. Marcus exhaled shakily. "Got jumped." Jake clenched his jaw. "By who?" Marcus hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "Cops." Jake's blood ran cold. Marcus looked away. "They didn't even arrest me, just roughed me up and left." Jake felt rage bubbling under his skin. Not because cops had hurt Marcus, but because he had once been one of them. Because he had done the same thing to other kids just like Marcus. And now he was on the other side of it. Something inside Jake snapped into place. This wasn't just about his redemption anymore. This was about making sure this never happened to Marcus or any other kid again. He had spent years being part of the problem. Now he had to be part of the solution. And for the first time in his life, Jake Mitchell knew exactly where he stood.